Have you ever noticed that we spend an awful lot of time trying to avoid consequences? We buy insurance against them. We hire lawyers because of them. We make excuses because of them. We blame other people because of them. Sometimes we even blame God because of them. But have you ever stopped to ask a different question? Why do consequences even exist? Why is the world built this way? Why can't I eat junk food for 20 years and still expect to have perfect health? Why can't I neglect my marriage for years and expect it to remain strong? Why can't I lie often enough that people stop believing me and then somehow expect trust to magically return? Why doesn't reality simply let us do whatever we want without ever making us pay the price? Tonight, I want to suggest something that has changed the way I think almost everything. It's a simple sentence, but if it's true, it explains far more than we usually realize. Here it is. Reality always sends the bill. Welcome back to Crusade With Me. I'm Dave, and I'm glad you're here. Tonight it's not going to be a Bible study. It's not going to be a political discussion, and it's going to be one of those episodes where I tell you 10 easy steps to fix your life. Instead, I just want to observe something together. Something that every one of us already knows, but very few of us stop long enough to think about it. Because once you begin to notice it, you start seeing it everywhere. Reality always sends the bill. Now, I don't know who first said this, but I love the saying. Sooner or later, everyone sits down to a banquet of consequences. That's funny, but it is also frightening because it's true. And notice it doesn't say good consequences or bad consequences. It just says consequences. Because reality doesn't play favorites. Reality simply responds. Okay. Think about gravity. Gravity doesn't care whether you're a good person. Gravity doesn't care whether you're religious. Gravity doesn't care whether you're rich. Gravity doesn't care whether you had good intentions. You can stand on top of a ladder and say, I don't believe in gravity. And gravity politely will say, that's fine. And let's see how you find out anyway. See, reality has no emotions. It simply is. And I wonder if that's why reality is one of our greatest teachers. Not because it lectures us, but because it never lies. You can ignore it. You can argue with it. You can deny it. Reality doesn't argue back. It simply waits. I spent nearly 40 years in manufacturing. Machines taught me this. Maintenance taught me this. If you skip preventative maintenance, the machine keeps running at first. Nothing happens. Weeks go by, generally. Months go by. Then you begin to think, see? Nothing bad happened then. On Tuesday morning at 2:17 a.m., the bearing fails. Production stops. Everybody is standing around. Management is frustrated. Shipping is going to be behind now. Customers are waiting. Thousands of dollars disappear. And somebody says, what happened? The answer is, nothing happened today. The bill finally arrived today. The choices happened weeks ago. Reality simply waited until payment was due. And when I think about it, machines may be more honest than people because they don't care about excuses. They don't care about intention. They respond to reality. And isn't that how our bodies work too? Nobody becomes unhealthy overnight. Nobody wakes up at 55 years old and says, I wonder what happened. Reality knows. Reality has been sending little invoices for years. Maybe it was one skipped workout, one fast food meal, one cigarette, one extra drink, a couple of hours of less sleep. None of them seemed important. In the scheme of things, each one was tiny, almost invisible. Until enough tiny choices accumulated. Then the bill arrived. Now here's what fascinates me. The bill almost always surprises us. Not because reality changed, because we stopped paying attention. I wonder how many areas of our lives are exactly like that. Not exploding, not collapsing, not failing, just quietly adding up. That's how consequences usually work. They're not dramatic. They're cumulative. One lie. No big deal. One more lie. Still okay. One more. Still surviving. Then one day, someone doesn't believe anything you say anymore. Not because of today's lie, because yesterday's bill finally came due. You know, just like one workout won't make you healthy, One missed workout won't make you unhealthy, but hundreds? Reality keeps excellent records. And that's why I think consequences are less like lightning and more like compound interest. You hardly notice them until one day they're all you can see. You know, I remember financial experts saying something years ago. Most people don't go broke because of one gigantic purchase. They go broke because of hundreds of little ones. A streaming subscription. Another streaming subscription. Coffee every morning. Or a Monster. Or whatever. Eating out. Buying things they really didn't need, little by little. Reality keeps adding columns. Eventually, the math becomes impossible to ignore. Reality sends the bill. And here's something I've noticed about myself. And maybe you've noticed it too. When the bill comes, my first instinct isn't to ask, what choices led here? My first instinct usually is, why is this happening to me? Isn't that interesting? We immediately assume life is unfair. But maybe life is simply honest. Not cruel. Not unfair. Honest. That thought alone has changed the way I look at almost everything. Because if reality is honest, then consequences aren't my enemy. They're information. They're feedback. They're reality saying something upstream needs attention. You know what we call it when your dashboard light comes on? A warning. You know what we often do? Ignore it. Or get creative. Put black tape over it. Problem solved. Until the engine blows. See, reality doesn't care whether you covered the light. Reality was trying to help you. I'm trying to think back in my life. I'm wondering how many warning lights I've ignored. How about you? And our health, our marriage, our friendships, our finances, our spiritual lives, our attention, our character. The light came on years ago. Reality wasn't punishing us. Reality was inviting us to pay attention. I think that's the key. Consequences are rarely the first message. They're usually the last one. And that leads me to something I've been thinking about lately. What if consequences aren't punishment? What if they're simply reality telling us the truth? Because reality always tells the truth. And reality always sends the bill. But here's where it even gets more interesting. If that's true about machines and bodies and finances, what about relationships? Because relationships may be the place where we ignore reality longer than anywhere else. Because I want to talk about that. I want to talk about the invoices we never see coming until it's too late. You know, machines are actually pretty easy. If a bearing fails, you replace the bearing. If a motor burns up, you replace the motor. If belts snap, you install new belts. Machines are complicated, but they're predictable. People are different. People have hearts. People have memories. People have trust. And trust is one of the most remarkable things in the world. Because trust isn't built in one grand moment. It's built in thousands of tiny ones. A kept promise. Showing up on time. Listening. Telling the truth when it's uncomfortable. Doing what you said you would do. Being present. Being faithful. One decision at a time. Just like interest in a savings account, you don't notice it every day, but over time, it becomes something incredibly valuable. The sad part is, the opposite is also true. Trust doesn't usually disappear because of one catastrophic event. Sometimes it does, but more often, it leaks away. One disappointment. One broken promise. One sarcastic comment. One lie. One forgotten anniversary. One evening when work mattered more than home. One conversation that never happened. One apology that was never offered. None of them seem big enough to destroy a relationship. Individually, they aren't. Together, they become an invoice. You know, in the end of September, Kat and I will be celebrating our 40th wedding anniversary. And as my daughter reminds me, I'm a lucky man. There's a story behind that. I'll share that sometime. But I'll let you know now. My daughter was probably 5, maybe 6 years old. We had come home from church. We were sitting at the kitchen table eating lunch and discussing some things about church. Somebody had told me a joke. It was, disparaging to women. And I repeated the joke at the kitchen table. And so terrible timing on my part, not a good choice. I regretted that. But Abby had this innate ability. Well, first of all, Abby just loved to talk. Okay, Abby still loves to talk, but I mean, Abby really loved to talk when she was 5 and 6. And she's sitting in her chair off to my right. Andrew's on my left, and Kathy's across the table from me. And Abby's kind of wagging, she's talking to me and wagging her finger at me, and it kind of struck me. And I took my hand and I put it on her finger and I pushed her hand down to the table. And I said, Abby, you are not my mother or my wife. So you're not going to talk to me that way. And Kathy was kind of smirking. And Abby got a little bit of a grin on her face too. And I'm looking at both of them kind of smirking, and I'm like, you two are two peas in a pod. And Abby, I don't know, she's little, 5, maybe 6. I think she was 5. She said, and you are a lucky man. And then Kathy lost it. She was laughing, and I was a little bit hot under the collar, to be honest with you. But back to Kathy and I'm going to tell you something. I have my highs in life. I have my lows in life. And if you've experienced lows in life, I want you to understand how important it is to stand close to that person who's having a low point in their life. And Kathy has been that person to me. When I was adding to the invoices, Kathy was adding to the receipts. And it makes a huge difference in the world. And it goes both ways, right? There has been times, I think we've been very candid. Kathy's got some chronic illness. And so she's had some very difficult health issues and difficult times with health. And just raising 2 rambunctious, okay, they weren't really that rambunctious, but 2 kids. So she was putting out invoices while I was cashing receipts. Or she was making invoices and I was making receipts. It kind of works. And I hope and pray that every marriage could be like that. Is it perfect? No. Does she get on my nerves? Absolutely. Do I get on her nerves? I doubt it, but you can ask her. But anyway. Look, life is not the movies. And we haven't done everything right. We do argue. We do disagree. But this is the thing that, and I've talked to Kathy extensively about this. We got married really young. And especially when the kids were young. And she'll tell you this. And I've talked about it before on episodes. We had to understand expectations and had to talk through, what do you expect? Because neither one of us are very good mind readers. That's writing receipts instead of invoices. Because one of the greatest lies our culture tells us is that relationships fail because people fell out of love. I'm not convinced. I think many relationships fail because people slowly stopped paying attention. Rarely does love die suddenly. Attention usually dies first. Then curiosity. Then gratitude. Then affection. Then conversation. Then one day people look at each other and say, I don't know what happened. Reality knows. Reality kept every receipt. Isn't that interesting? We say someone drifted apart. Drifting isn't an event. It's a process. My good buddy got his retirement lake house now, we were talking about. Something I learned, he's huge and he loves sailing. Now, he's in a small inland lake. That would be hard to sail there, but we were watching some J-class sailboats, races. And I've loved, I had went out one time, a maintenance inspector I worked with had a 36-foot sailboat. And we took it from Hammond, Indiana, sailed across to Chicago and back. And I loved it, but I'm going to tell you something that I read. No sailor wakes up one morning and says, how did we end up 50 miles off course? The answer is simple. You were 1 degree off for a pretty good amount of time. And that image has stayed with me. 1 degree. That's all. Not 90. Not 180. 1 tiny degree. Almost impossible to notice today. Impossible to ignore 5 days later. I wonder if our lives work the same way. What if most disasters don't begin with one giant decision? What if they begin with tiny ones? One compromise. One excuse. One shortcut. One conversation avoided. One habit neglected. One truth ignored. Reality doesn't send the bill immediately. Reality waits. I've noticed something in leadership over the years. People almost never lose credibility in one meeting. They lose it one decision at a time. I've seen supervisors slowly stop doing what they expect everyone else to do. They arrive a little later. Leave a little earlier. Hold others accountable, but not themselves. At first, nobody says anything. Then one day they wonder why nobody follows them anymore. Reality already knows. Leadership is rented. and the rent is due every single day. Makes me think of it. Had a boss years and years and years ago when I was in the mills still. I was a melter on a BOF vessels. And this guy was just tough as nails. He was old school. He would mess with people. And as a supervisor, he could certainly mess with supervisors. He had general foreman reporting to him. And just tough. Not a happy camper. And I remember, we had 300-ton steel BOF vessels. So we'd be charging one while blowing one, and then we'd tap that one out and have the other one charged. And so we started tapping the one out, we'd start blowing the other one. And, we always constantly had to turn them furnaces down and look in there. And at that time, we would get samples, turn it down, have to reach in with a rod, get a sample out, stick a temperature probe in, get the temperature reading of inside the vessel. And that was a good time for us to take a look inside the furnace and look at the lining. And so not only was I looking at the bath, the steel bath, I was also looking at the lining. And I could see that what I thought looked like a hole at the end on the inside. Now, you got to remember, I'm looking through blue cobalt glasses because you can't look into the furnace because it's 3,000 degrees plus. You can't see anything but a glow. So I'm looking through these cobalt glasses, and I see that it is. So I'm walking around the side of the vessel, walking back to the shanty where I'll tell the third casting man or the third furnace man to get the how much aluminum and how much other additives we needed to put into the ladle. And around the center of the vessel, a BOF vessel, they have a huge, it's a 300-ton vessel. So it has a really large water jacket that runs around the outside of it. But there's a gap between it. That water jacket is just where it pools it to help cool the water before they put it back into the lining to help keep the furnace. And I see on the steel behind the water jacket, the steel's glowing red. So I call I called on the PA system. I see a red spot on, I can't remember which vessel it was. I know it was, I just can't remember what the number. It was vessel number 1. And I said, roll it over, tap it out. So they roll it over, we're tapping it out, and I'm helping the guys get the additives together, put in a ladle, because I just want to get the steel out of the furnace. So we did that, and had to make this dreadful call and call this boss. And wake him up at Dark 100 and tell him, I got a red spot on the furnace. It's not looking good. We're going to do something. He says, so he wakes up, I tell him, he says, I'll be there. I said, okay. So he comes in, and we had already started. We had got a laser readings on the inside of the furnace, which was quite a process. And he comes in, and, he's groggy-eyed. I mean, I woke him up out of his middle of his sleep. He comes in, he looks at the furnace, and he's reading the readouts, and he says, let's go back to the shanty. Now, he and I had words before in that shanty when he was kind of messing with me. And he puts his arm underneath my arm. It's almost like we're on a date, right? Like if you extend your hand for a lady. Well, he does that to me. And he says, how did that feel when you called me? I said, well, it didn't make me feel any better to have to call you. I says, but my stomach was already in knots after I saw that red spot on the outside of the furnace. He said, I figured you'd feel that way. He says, I never want you to forget that. And that was it. He didn't yell, scream, berate, all the things I thought he was going to do. I developed a whole new sense of respect. He was just an old school guy. I got a whole different sense of respect for him in that moment. And the point is simple. Leadership is earned in drops and lost in buckets. So here's something that took me decades to understand. People don't usually listen to our words. They watch our patterns. And our patterns tell the truth. That's true of parents, too. Children don't become who they tell them to be. More often, they become who they watch. That's both encouraging and terrifying. Because every ordinary Tuesday is teaching something. Not just birthdays, not Christmas, not vacations. Tuesday, the quiet day, the repetitive days. Those are the days that shape families. It reminds me of something that Jesus said. Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. I've often thought that we read that backwards. We assume our treasure follows our hearts. Jesus seems to suggest our hearts follow what we repeatedly invent or invest in. So attention, time, energy, presence. Again, small things. Repeated faithfully. You know what strikes me? Reality is patient. Reality never hurries. Reality doesn't shout. Reality whispers. Year after year. Choice after choice. Habit after habit. Until eventually our lives become the sum of what we've repeatedly done. Which, in my twisted mind, raises a fascinating question. If consequences are cumulative, what exactly are they accumulating? Money? Health? Relationships? Yes. But I think something even deeper, it's deeper happening than that. I don't think our choices are merely producing outcomes. I think they're producing us. Every repeated decision is quietly answering one question. Who am I becoming? Not what am I accomplishing? Not what am I owning? Not what am I achieving? Who am I becoming? That's where I think we've misunderstood life. We've been obsessed with outcomes. Reality seems to be more interested in formation, because every habit is shaping a person. Every repeated action is carving a character. Every ordinary decision is writing tomorrow's story. And I think that's where we'll go next. Because if reality always sends the bill, it isn't just charging us for what we've done. It's revealing who we've become. And that may be the greatest consequence of all. I want to explore something that honestly changed the way I think about discipline, about freedom, and even about following Christ. Because I don't believe your habits simply change your life. I think your habits slowly become your identity. And that's where reality's deepest invoices begin to arrive. You know, when I was a young guy, I thought life was mostly about making decisions. Good decisions, bad decisions, wise decisions, foolish decisions. I suppose that's true, but I've come to believe something a little different. I don't think our lives are primarily shaped by the decisions we make. I think they're shaped by the patterns we repeat. Because repetition has a way of becoming identity. Think about it. Nobody wakes up one morning and says, "Today, I think I'm going to become an honest man." It doesn't work that way. You tell the truth. Again. And again. And again. Until one day, people simply know you're an honest person. Not because you announced it, because reality announced it. The opposite's true as well. No one wakes up intending to become bitter or lazy or selfish or unreliable. Those identities aren't chosen all at once. They're accumulated. One excuse, one resentment, one compromise, one shortcut. One, "I'll do it tomorrow." Reality keeps writing it all down. I've started thinking about life like a courtroom. But now I want to switch it to be more like a sculptor's studio. Because every decision is another strike of the chisel. Some remove what doesn't belong. Some damage what was beautiful. But every strike changes the sculpture. So you may not notice it after one blow. You certainly notice it after 10,000. And I wonder if that's why habits are so powerful. Habits are simply choices that no longer require much thought. Right? That's a habit. They become automatic. And automatic things shape automatic people. We often say, "I'm just trying to break a bad habit." Maybe. But perhaps a better question is, what kind of a person am I becoming if I keep repeating this? That's a much harder question, because it moves beyond behavior. It reaches identity. You know, I've confessed, or whatever you want to call it on this podcast, several times. I've smoked for over 50 years, and I have, quote unquote, successfully quit a couple times. I know it's not the greatest thing for my health. And as I'm getting older and I want to improve my health, so I'm making plans on reducing. And when I talk about reducing, I'm just talking about, okay, a year ago I smoked 2 packs a day. I'm happy to report that I am down to about 1 pack a day now, and hopefully in another year I can be down to none. But I'm trying to do it a little bit at a time. And I learned that through, what's the name of that book? Clear wrote it. Atomic Habits. And I can think about work too. One of the things I love about working in manufacturing is that we talked constantly about systems. And so I don't know if work made me a systems person or I was a system person and I just happened to do this work, but this is what I know. People love to blame outcomes. Good organizations study systems. Defective parts keep coming off the line. You don't yell at the finished product. You examine the process. You ask, what upstream created this? Then I wonder, why are we so much wiser with machines than we are with ourselves? When our lives aren't producing what we hoped, our instinct is to work harder for a week. Reality asks a different question. What system produced this life? That's uncomfortable. But it's honest. If I want healthier relationships, I need healthier daily habits. If I want stronger faith, I need different daily practices. If I want more peace, perhaps I need different things feeding my mind. Because reality doesn't care about intention. Reality responds to my patterns. I think this is one of the reasons our culture struggles so much. We've become obsessed with instant results. Lose 20 pounds in 30 days. Build wealth overnight. 30-second videos. One-click shopping. Immediate gratification. Everything faster. Everything easier. Everything now. Reality smiles and continues operating at the speed of truth. Truth takes time. Trust takes time. Wisdom takes time. Character takes time. Oak trees take time. Children take time. Marriages take time. Disciples take time. Reality refuses to be rushed. And that may be one of the greatest gifts God built into creation. The most valuable things cannot be microwaved. They must be cultivated. Which brings me to something I think about often. We use the word freedom in interesting ways. We usually think freedom means I can do whatever I want. But is that really freedom? Suppose I ate whatever I want, whenever I want, however much I want. Eventually, my appetite begins to making decisions for me. Who's free now? Suppose I spend every dollar I earn. Am I free? Or am I now owned by debt? Suppose I tell lies whenever they're convenient. Eventually, I'm forced to remember every lie I've told. That doesn't sound like freedom. I know because I've lived that. That sounds exhausting, and it is because I've lived it. I've begun to wonder if discipline isn't the opposite of freedom. Maybe discipline is the pathway to it. Because every healthy discipline removes a future burden. Every unhealthy habit creates one. Reality always balances the books. That's why I think consequences aren't just punishment waiting around the corner. They're teachers. Every consequence is asking a question. What did this choice produce? Not to shame us, to teach us. Reality is an excellent teacher because it never cheats. It never exaggerates. It never plays favorites. It simply reflects what we've repeatedly chosen. And here's something I wish some had explained to me years ago. There's a huge difference between guilt and conviction. Guilt says you're worthless. Conviction says this is the path. Reality doesn't tell you that you're beyond hope. Reality simply says this road goes there. If you keep walking north, you'll eventually reach north. If you keep walking south, you'll eventually reach the south. Reality isn't judging you. Reality is describing the direction. I think that's incredibly helpful. Because if our repeated choices formed us, then different repeated choices can reform us. One honest conversation, one prayer, one act of forgiveness, one morning spent reading instead of scrolling, one apology, one walk, one phone call, tiny things, repeated faithfully. Reality keeps those receipts too. I've noticed that we tend to think God only notices our failures. I'm going to tell you, Scripture paints a different picture. He notices sparrows, widow's coins, mustard seeds, tiny acts of faith, little things. The kingdom seems to grow the same way reality grows. Quietly, patiently, faithfully. which makes me wonder. Maybe heaven's always understood something we've forgotten. Small things matter. Not because they're dramatic, because they become us. Now, everything we talked about raises one enormous question. If reality always tells the truth, if reality always sends the bill, then what do we do when the bill is bigger than we can pay? Because sooner or later, every one of us discovers that there are consequences we cannot simply undo. That's where I think Christianity says something astonishing. Not sentimental. Not simplistic. Astonishing. When the bill is bigger than you can pay, there comes a moment in almost every life when reality hands us a bill we cannot pretend it isn't there anymore. Maybe it's a diagnosis. Maybe it's a divorce. Maybe it's the loss of a friend. Maybe it's an addiction. Maybe it's a debt. Maybe it's the realization that the person staring back from the mirror isn't the person you thought you were becoming. Reality has a way of bringing us to moments where excuses stop working. And strangely enough, those moments may be the greatest turning point in our lives. I've noticed something over the years. Pain has a language. Success often whispers. Comfort distracts us. Pain gets our attention. Now, I don't enjoy pain. I don't pray for pain. But if I'm honest, some of the greatest lessons I've ever learned came because reality finally got my attention. Not because God hated me, because reality refused to lie to me. I wonder if you've experienced that too. Looking back years later and realizing, I thought that was the worst thing that ever happened to me. But it may have been the thing that finally woke me up. How many of us can honestly say that? Because the point of all of that is that reality can become a teacher instead of an enemy. There's something else I've been thinking about. We often say, don't judge me. Dear old Jerry Springer. I understand that people, what they mean by that. None of us want to be condemned. But here's something interesting. Reality doesn't judge. Reality reveals. So if I plant corn, I don't harvest soybean. Not because the field judged me, because the field revealed what I planted. If I neglect my health, my body isn't judging me. It's It's revealing what I've repeatedly chosen. If I nurture a friendship, that friendship often becomes stronger. Not because the friendship rewarded me, because reality revealed the fruit of intention. That word, fruit, I love that. Jesus used it constantly. He didn't say, look at what people claim. He said, look at the fruit. Fruit is visible. Fruit grows slowly. Fruit tells the truth. You don't tape apples onto a dead tree. Eventually, reality exposes the difference. Let's be honest. I think we've become very good at managing appearances. Social media helps us do that. We can photograph the vacation, not the loneliness. We can post the promotion, not the anxiety. We can share the highlight reel, not the backstage. Reality isn't fooled by appearances. Reality always knows what is actually growing. And maybe that's one reason we're exhausted. Because maintaining an image requires enormous energy. Living truthfully requires courage. But strangely, it's much lighter. Here's something I've been chewing on for months. What if repentance isn't mostly about feeling guilty? What if repentance is simply agreeing with reality? Think about that. The Greek word metanoia means a change of mind, a reorientation, a turning. It's the moment you stop arguing with reality and begin walking with it. I've always loved that. Repentance isn't pretending you never made a mistake. It's finally saying, reality was right, and then taking the next fateful step. I think that's one reason Jesus spoke so often about truth. Not because truth wins arguments, because truth aligns us with reality. And reality is where life actually happens. There are moments in Scripture that suddenly make more sense when viewed this way. The truth will set you free. Why? Because lies require constant maintenance. That's why. Truth doesn't. Reality doesn't need our help. Reality simply is. I don't know about you, but I've spent enough years trying to force reality to match my preferences, and it never works. Reality is wonderfully stubborn, and honestly, I'm thankful. Because if reality changed every time I wanted it to, I would never be able to trust it. Which brings us to the cross. And this is where I think Christianity says something unlike any other worldview. Not that consequences aren't real, they are. Not that sin doesn't matter, it does. Not that reality can simply be ignored. It can. Christianity never says consequences disappear. Christianity says God entered them. Think about that for a minute. Jesus didn't come to explain suffering from a safe distance. He walked into it. He didn't explain death away. He died. He didn't merely tell us about forgiveness. He forgave while hanging on a cross. He didn't eliminate consequences by pretending it wasn't real. He bore it. That changes everything. Because the cross tells me two things at exactly the same time. First, reality is more serious than I imagined. And secondly, God's love is greater than I imagined. And those two truths belong together. If you separate them, you lose the gospel. Notice what Jesus doesn't do. He doesn't tell the woman caught in adultery, it doesn't matter. He doesn't tell Zacchaeus, keep cheating people. He doesn't tell Peter, oh, your denial was meaningless. Reality mattered. But grace met people inside reality, not outside it. And that's why I think Christianity is the most hopeful story ever told. Because it never asks us to deny reality. It asks us to walk through reality with Christ. So if reality always sends the bill, and Christ entered reality instead of escaping it, then maybe the question isn't how do I avoid consequences? Maybe the better question is, how do I begin living in harmony with reality? And that's kind of where I want to leave you with tonight, because I think that's where wisdom begins. You know, when I first started thinking about this episode, I assumed it was going to be about consequences. But somewhere along the way, I realized it's really about consequences at all. It's about reality. Consequences are simply the language reality speaks. They're the feedback. They're the receipts. They're the invoices. Reality is simply telling us this is where the road leads. I've spent years on this earth not knowing something. Life has a remarkable way of stripping away illusions. When we're young, we think talent is enough. Later, we discover character matters more. We think intentions are enough. Later, we discover actions matter. We think one big decision changes everything. Later, we discover it's the 1,000 little decisions that quietly became a life. Reality is patient. Reality doesn't rush. Reality simply waits for enough days to pass. Then it reveals what has been growing all along. You know what fascinates me? An oak tree doesn't become an oak tree overnight. Neither does a marriage. Neither does a friendship. Neither does faith. Neither does wisdom. They all grow the same way. Quietly. Slowly. Almost invisibly. Until one day, everyone notices what years have been producing. And maybe that's why Scripture talks so much about walking. Not sprinting, not leaping, walking. One step, then another, then another. A life isn't built in dramatic moments. It's built in ordinary Tuesdays. And that's where reality does most of its work. Episode earlier this week, I talked about our time at the Jasper County Fair and watching these kids deal with animals that they have to care for. And it's such a great lesson to watch these young kids and know that as they get these ribbons and awards, a lot of them, not all of them, but a lot of them have put in a lot of unseen hours, unseen time, depending on what they're doing. Could be a lot of riding in vehicles to get to places to do the things you need to do to prepare for Fair Week. It's pretty amazing. And it also makes me think about farmers and farming. And farmers don't plant corn today and dig it up tomorrow to see if it's growing. The farmer trusts the process. He waters, he weeds, he waits. He knows reality has seasons. We've forgotten that. We want Amazon Prime spirituality. Okay, I made that up. 2-day wisdom, instant peace, 30-second transformation. Reality doesn't work that way. Neither does God. Both seem remarkably comfortable with slow growth. Here's another thought I can't shake. Maybe wisdom isn't knowing more facts. Maybe wisdom is learning how reality actually works and then living in agreement with it. And I think that's why the book of Proverbs has always fascinated me. Proverbs isn't full of arbitrary rules. It's full of observations. It's almost as though Solomon spent his life watching reality, then wrote down what he saw. The diligent prosper. The lazy struggle. Pride goes before destruction. A gentle answer turns away wrath. These aren't magical formulas. They're observations about reality. And maybe that's what wisdom has always been. Not creating reality, recognizing it. And that brings me back to where we started. Reality always sends the bill. At first, that sounded discouraging. Until you realize something. Reality also pays dividends. Reality rewards consistency. Reality rewards honesty. Reality rewards humility. Reality rewards forgiveness. Reality rewards discipline. Reality rewards attention. Reality rewards love. Reality isn't against you. Reality is simply faithful. It always produces what has been planted. And that's why this episode isn't meant to leave you feeling guilty. It's meant to leave you feeling hopeful. Because of small choices created today's life. Small choices can begin creating tomorrow's. You don't have to fix everything tonight. You don't have to solve every problem. You don't have to become someone different before breakfast tomorrow. You simply have to take the next fateful step. Then another. Then another. Because reality keeps every receipt, including the good ones. And that's where Christ becomes such good news. Not because he gives us permission to ignore reality, because he teaches us to live inside it. He calls himself the truth. Not merely someone who speaks truth. Truth, it's himself. Reality, ultimately, isn't an idea. Reality is a person. When we walk with him, we begin walking with reality instead of fighting it. And I think that's what discipleship has always been. Learning to stop demanding that reality change for us and allowing Christ to change us so that we can live truthfully within his creation. So tonight, before you go to sleep, don't think about the giant decisions. Think about tomorrow morning. What one conversation needs to happen. What one apology needs to be offered. What one habit needs to begin. What one distraction needs to end. What one person needs to hear from you. What one step moves you closer to the person Christ is forming you to become. Because that's how lives change. Not all at once. One faithful step. One honest decision. One ordinary Tuesday. Reality is already writing tomorrow's receipts. The question is, what story will it tell? So next time on Crusade With Me, we're going to take this one step deeper. Tonight we've asked what reality does. Next time we're going to ask, what is truth? Is truth just whatever works? Is it whatever I feel? Whatever the majority believes? Or is truth something far more ancient, far more beautiful, far more dangerous than we've imagined? If reality always sends the bill, then perhaps truth is the accounting system behind the entire universe. And if that's true, it changes everything. Thank you for spending part of your day with me. And if this conversation made you stop and think and share it with someone who might need to hear it, not because I need another download, but because all of us need people who are willing to pursue truth together. Until next time, keep asking good questions, keep paying attention, keep walking toward Christ, because every faithful step matters. This is Crusade with me, and I'm Dave, and remember, reality always sends the bill, but grace teaches us how to live before it arrives. We'll see you next time.